Today's daf is daf ayin, and let's just review what we know from the bottom of Samach Tes Amid Beis in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. The Gemara records machlokes between Rav Huna and Rabbah, and this is attached to the Mishnah, which speaks about kedushas bechor. That's peterechen. So the firstborn of the animal, the mother is giving birth for the first time, that Vlad, that fetus is Kadosh B'Kedushas Bechor, and therefore the issue becomes at what point is the Vlad considered born? And that's the moment in which there will be a chalos of Kedushas Bechor. And we'll soon see the nafkamina, but according to Rav Huna, who says Lemafreya Kadosh, that means if, let's say, for example, 1/3 of the ubar came out of its mother's womb, and the owner of the mother animal sold that 1/3 of the ubar to a guy, and you might think that since the guy has shutfis and he's a part owner of the Vlad, therefore it doesn't have Kedushas Bechor, because the Gemara derives that if the Akum owns part of the Bechor, then there's no Kedushas Bechor. But here, says Rav Huna, Lemafreya Kadosh, that the Kedusha is Chal from the moment of birth. And even though the animal hasn't yet given birth, so at this point, when 1/3 of the fetus exited from the mother's womb, it was not yet Kadosh B'Kedushas Bechor, but the Kedushas Bechor will be Chal retroactively from the moment that the birth took place. So therefore, already at the time that the Jew sold his third, that third of the ubar to the guy, there was Kedushas Bechor, and then the Jew doesn't have legal rights to sell a Bechor. Basically, it doesn't belong to him. However, Rabbah disagrees, and Rabbah holds that from the moment of birth and on, that's when the Kedushas Bechor is Chal, and therefore, at the time of the sale of 1/3 of the Ubar to the guy, this was before the Leda, because Leda means most of the body came out of the womb. So at that point, if there was no Kedushas Bechor, therefore, according to Rabbah, who says Mikan Lahaba, therefore the sale was valid. The Gemara then goes on to quote another machlokes between Rabbah and Rav Huna, and the Gemara wants to say that they are interdependent. They're Haba Atali. They're basically consistent. And what was the other machlokes that was recorded? That was a case where the the wall of the womb was opened at one point, let's say for argument's sake through some sort of cesarean. At that point, that section of the wall of the womb that was open was only 1/3. And the fetus went out of that 1/3, but only 1/3 of the fetus was able to exit through that opening, and 2/3 went out through the womb that was not opened. And Rav Huna says, Eino Kadosh, that there's no Kedushas Bechor in this case, because Rav Huna consistently holds L'mafreya Kadosh, and therefore the Kedusha is Chal from the time, from the moment that the majority of the fetus emerges, And then it's Chal Mafreya, because Rav Huna holds a Mafreya Kadosh, which means that in this particular case, because one third had already exited through that opening in the wall, so to go from 33 and a third percent up to 50 plus, meaning 50 and 1%, we'll call it, is less than 33%. Let's call it 17%. I'm just throwing out a number. Not, so therefore, most of the Leda already took place at the time that the 51% of the fetus left. And at that point, it was already, just one second. Right. And one third had already left through the Dauphin, meaning through the opening in the wall. So therefore, it's a situation where the Gemara calls it Ruba Kama Lesa Berechem. And Rabbah Omar Kadosh, because Rabbah holds that Mikan Ulahaba Kadosh. So we look at the total emergence of the animal from the womb of its mother. And this is a case of Ruba Derech Rechem Nafik. Right? So the majority of the animal went out through the Rechem, right? Because two-thirds went out through the Rechem, and therefore it's Kadosh. And the Gemara, if you recall, had a whole discussion why we need both cases. And the Gemara says we might have thought that Rav Huna is only being machmir because he has a suffix, and so forth and so on. So let's pick up today where we left off yesterday, which is Boy Rava. So Boy Rava is about 12 lines down from the top. And Rava has the following suffix. Holchu be'ivarim achar rov, o lo holchu be'ivarim achar rov. So does the principle of Rov apply with regard to the limbs of a Bechar? Hechidami. The Gemara wants to know what's the case. And the Gemara has one possibility which it rejects because the Gemara thinks that there's no room for a suffix in this case. Kigon sheyotza rov b'miut aver. Let's say, for example, the majority of the ubar, that's again a bechar, emerged already from the womb. But in order to achieve that rove, you have to add the limb that was that most of the limb was still inside. So again, in order to get to rove, you have to add a smaller half of the limb. The larger half of the limb is still inside its mother's body. The Kami and again, the Gemara is going to reject this, but at this point, the suffix of Rava was Hai mute dibroi basa rov di aver shadinale o basa ruba di ubar shadinale. How do we define that minority part of the limb that exited the body? Is it drawn to the majority, which is inside the mother's body? So we can't calculate it as part of the majority to create a majority for Leda. Or do we say no? It's a separate entity, independent of its majority, and as such, is considered as if it left the womb of its mother, and we could therefore integrate it with the rest of the part of the fetus that left the womb, and therefore we have a rov and a leda. So Gemara says that couldn't be the suffix of Rab because Pshita, the Gemara understands that it's undeniable that the lo shavkina and ruba de ubar v'yaslida basarov aver. that this halacha that that the minority limb, which again left the womb of its mother, certainly is pulled along by the majority of the limb. Just one sec here. In other words, we look at the ubar, not at the limb. And if we define it by the ubar, since the majority of the ubar left the mother's body, then that majority of the ubar is going to schlep along with it the limb. We're not going to say that the limb belongs to the majority of the limb, but rather belongs to the majority of the ubar. Ella, so therefore we have to come up with another alternative explanation of Rava's Safek. Kigon, sheyotza chetzio. Exactly half of the fetus emerged from the womb. Barov Ava, but only if we integrate into that which left the ubar, that which left the womb of its mother, the rechem, as integrated with the majority of the limb. Bekami boile. So what's the suffix now of Rava? Hahu miut dibe gavoy. Gavoy means on the inside. So there's a miut, a minority of that limb that's still inside its mother's womb. Mahu. How do we define it? Lemishdei basa rov aver. In other words, here you don't have rov of the fetus that left its mother's womb. You only have half. So therefore, the ubar that was born, so to speak, is not powerful enough to determine the status of the aver. So now we have to look at the aver itself as a separate entity. And how do we define it? Do we say that that the rov aver now pulls the miut of the aver along with it, as if it was also out of its mother's womb, and then we have more than just chetzio, we have rov, and therefore there's labor. Or do we say no? The limb should be divided up into two parts. That which left the mother's womb, and then all you have is half. And that which remained within the mother's womb remains within the mother's womb. So again, let's go over the case. Most of that limb exited from the body. If we schlep along the minority that remained in with the rove, then we'd have a rove of the entire fetus that left the mother's womb, and it would be kadosh b'kedushas b'chor. Toshma, the Gemara wants to resolve this issue of Rava from our Mishnah. What does it say in our Mishnah? Yotza rubo hareza yikover. Now the word yikover, as we discussed yesterday, means that it has kedushas bechor. So what is this telling me? Is this telling me the obvious? I mean, that the majority of the fetus is considered as if the fetus exited and therefore it has kedushas bechor. My rubo ileba rubo mamish is ad hashta lo yashmeinan rubo kekulo. I mean, it's like facetious here. You just discovered in America that rubo kekulo. If majority of the fetus has left its mother's womb, then for sure that's a leda. I don't need the Mishnah to tell me this, elah, but rather there must be a different chiddush in the Mishnah. Kegon sheyotza chetzio berov aver. that we're going to allow the rove aver to schlep with it the minority of that limb. And now we could tip the scale over the 50% line as if 51%, etc., etc., had exited from its mother's womb, and that's a later, therefore it's got kadosh b'kedushas b'chor. And therefore you cover. Lo, the Gemara rejects. Why? Kigon sheyotza rubo b'miyut ever. The case of the Mishnah and the Chiddush of the Mishnah is that although a minority of that limb exited the mother's womb, we're not going to one second. I think he's saying that we're not going to allow the rove ubar to pull along with it that minority that left the mother's womb. Just let me translate the words. The loshav kinon rubo di ubar de behema. Ah, rove ubar. Okay, good. The dominant factor here is going to be the rove ubar, not the limb itself as a separate entity. And it's only a mute of the aver that left the womb. And therefore, if you would analyze the limb in and of itself, you would say, well, let's schlep the minority of the limb together with the majority of the limb. No, 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 no. We're going to go, the dominant factor that's kovea here is the ubar. Boy Rava. Now we're going to have three sveikos of Rava that are basically all identical. They're just different scenarios of the same question. The first one is kracho b'siv mahu, right? Siv is a fibrous substance that grows around the base of a palm tree. So he wrapped the fetus in this sieve before it was born. So then we have halach of chatzitza, meaning that the fetus never actually came in contact with the walls of the rechem, of the womb. So do we apply the principle of chatzitza? And therefore, the womb and the walls of the womb could not be mekadesh the bechor, the vlad, because there's a chatzitza between the walls of the womb and the vlad. Another case, taliso mao. Let's say he wraps up the fetus in a talis before its birth, or b'shal yuso mao. Or a third question, the same question over and over again. What if he wraps the ubar, the fetus, in an amniotic sac in the placenta? So Gemara says, forget about that last question. Scratch that. Bishul yaso urchehu. There's no way that you could call the amniotic sac a chatzitza because that's in nature. Ella bishul yacheres mahu. The third suffix should be in a case where he took the placenta of animal B and he wrapped it around the fetus that's in animal A. Is that called a chatzitza? Or do we say, since it's a placenta and the fetus is in nature surrounded by the placenta is not a chatzitza? Krachaso vachazaso votziaso mahu. And now we're talking about something called the yoletis. The yoletis is a woman who pulls a fetus out of its mother's womb in the process of birth, and she wrapped her hands around the fetus. Are her hands a chatzitza between the fetus and the walls of the womb? Now you have to keep in mind, says the Gemara, Echidami, either nafik derech reisha, if the fetus emerged head first, is petarte, then for sure that's already petarecha, because the head of the fetus is considered leda. Ella did nafak derech Magil Yosef. The animal came out feet first, and as the animal was coming out, she enveloped the fetus with her hands. Now, I'm just going to mention here in passing, Tosfos. Tosfos doesn't like Rashi, because Tosfos says there's no such thing as an attending woman for the birth of an animal. Attending woman, well, what's the fancy word that they call it?
Doula.
What's it called? A doula? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You have a doula for a human woman, not for a female animal giving birth. It's the shepherd that attends it, but here it's in B'lashon Nekeva. It says birachaso, kirachaso, lachazoso, botziaso. So who is this female? Tosfos learns. I don't know what the plural of fetus is. Feti, I don't know. Anyway, there are two fetuses inside this mother animal, a female and a male. They're twins. And as the male is exiting from the womb, the female behind it wraps her legs around the fetus, the male fetus. So the male fetus never actually came in contact with the walls of the womb. Anyway, another question. Bilasu chulda votziaso ma. Crazy. A weasel came along, put its head inside the womb of a pregnant animal, and swallowed the fetus, and then came out. So the fetus never exited with contact with the walls of the uterus. Gemara says, Hotziato, ha'fikte. Are you just repeating that which we asked over and over again? Whether or not there's a din of chatzitza if the animal emerges from the womb without touching the walls of the womb? Ella, but rather, what's the last question? Listen to this. This drives me nuts. Balato, the weasel put its mouth into the womb of the pregnant mother animal, swallowed up the fetus, then drew the fetus out of the womb, and then decided, you know what? It's not worth it. Puts his head, which is now has the fetus inside its belly, back into the womb, and spits forward the fetus back into the womb of the mother, like it was at the beginning, Mahu, and now the fetus exits through its mother's womb. So at one point in time, it did not have Kedushas Bechor because it did not come in contact with the walls of the womb, but now it goes back into the womb. I was very fascinated here by a quote from apparently a Tosfos somewhere in Shabbos, Kuf Mem, Kuf Nun Beis, I'd love to look it up, that such a scenario would hardly ever occur. A weasel, the whole thing. But we have a principle called Drosh V'Kabel Schar. The Gemara will analyze hypothetical questions. I'm very perplexed by this because the Gemara Menachos, if you recall, somebody came in, I think his name was Plimo, whatever, and he asked, what happens if a woman gives birth, a human woman, to a child with two heads, how much pigeon aben do you need? You have to impose both of them, or 5 slime or 10 slime. And the Gemara want to throw him out of the base medrash because what are you're making fun of us? You're asking questions that are totally hypothetical. How could a baby be born with two heads? Until the Gemara says they brought in a baby with two heads. There's a Gemara above Baba I remember about Rabbi Yirmiyah. The Gemara says that a gozel, that's like a baby pigeon, would only be medaded. It would only jump out of its shovach, out of its chicken coop, only up to 50 am. And then afkamina in Hashavas Aveda, if there's another shovach there, who do you return the chicken to? So Rabbi Yeri asks, what happens if it has one foot over here inside 50 am and the other foot outside the 50 am? So Gemara want to throw him out of the base medrash. Why are you asking such a stupid question? That's totally hypothetical. Didei potar, delav didei lo potar. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Hidbik shnei rechavim. This is the wildest case. There are two different female animals that are giving birth, and somehow they attach the two wombs together. And the fetus from mother A went into the womb of mother B, and mother B actually gave birth to the fetus of mother A. Didei potar? Is there a halacha that you only create a bechara through petarechem of didei, meaning it's your fetus? Oh, the lav didei lo potar. Oh, dilma the lav didei nami potar. Take. Boy ravacha niftiku kosle beis harechem mal. Let's say the walls of the birth canal somehow spread open in such a way that the vlad, the fetus, just slipped out of its mother's womb without coming into contact with the walls of the womb. Is avir rechem akadesh va'iko dilma negias rechem akadsha. What generates the kedusha b'char? Is it the actual physical contact with the walls of the uterus, or even the air space of the uterus is enough? Ve'oleka, and that's the suffix. Now I'm trying to recall. Maybe you could remind me. We had a sugya in Menachos, I think, about Tanur Mekadesh with regard to Shtei Lechem. And the Gemara there also raised the issue about Avir Tanur, whether it's Mekadesh. I don't know. Anyway. Boy mar bar Rav Ashi, another suffix, Nekro Kosei Beis Harechem Mau. The walls of the birth canal were torn off. So the Gemara says, Nekru Lesnu. So there's certainly no Kedush Bechar if the Bechar didn't come out of the womb of its mother. The mother had a hysterectomy. Ella, but rather nekru v'solule b'tzavari mau. Somehow they tore off the walls of the birth canal, but it was on top of the neck of the fetus. That's how it sort of suspended. Then Makadesh, we say that the walls of the rechem are only Makadesh and generate Kedusha B'char only in its natural state. And that's Bimkoma. But Shalom Bimkoma, if it's not in its natural place, Lo Makache. O Dilma Shalom Bimkoma, not Makache. What should we say? Even if it's in a different place, nevertheless, the walls of the womb could be Makadesh the fetus. Boy, mine Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Zera, nig mimu kosle beisarechemau. They peeled away the walls of the of the rechem of the womb. Okay. He says the entire circumference of the birth canal was peeled off. Amalei, Reb Zera says to Reb Yirmiyah in response, Konagato b'bayadi boilin. I can give you an answer to your question based on a question that we analyzed. What was the question that we analyzed? The boy Rabbi Zera, the Amrile boy mine Rabbi Zera miravasi, Omeid merubala parutz. Now we get shivers as we get associations with Masechta Eruvin. V'yatza derech parutz. Okay, so we're going to have two issues, two questions that Reb Zera analyzes, and they're just flip sides of the same fundamental issue. What happens if part of the wall of the womb was peeled away? But omeid merubal parts. The part of the womb that was peeled away was the minority of the walls of the uterus. So right now we have rove of the walls of the uterus, but the problem is that the ubar decided to exit from its mother womb through the parts, through the part where there is no wall, or the opposite case. Let's say the majority of the walls of the uterus were peeled. You only have a minority of the walls of the uterus that is open, and the uber decide to go through that part where there is a wall. What's the law? So now Reb Zera is going to show how his inquiry touches on that of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Ad kan lo iboyle parts mubala omed. The whole suffix was only because there is an omed, albeit it's the minority, but there is some walls of the uterus left. Dikabol aval nigmamu. If the entire walls of the uterus were peeled away, lo kami boile, we didn't have a suffix. Then for sure, there's nothing to be makadish the bukhar. We need the walls of the uterus. There are no walls of this uterus. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on Amud Beis.